Today I want to speak about one of the most controversial topics in Ethiopian history: slavery in Ethiopia. When I visited the Geralta Mountains in the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia last year, I visited different rock-hewn churches, very ancient churches that date back to the 3rd century after Christ. And in the St. Michael Church, I spotted this one particular ancient painting that left me with so many questions. This painting showed an Ethiopian light-skinned lady together with her, what my guide called a servant, which can also be understood as her slave. And the interesting part about the servant was that she was a dark-skinned woman. And I started asking questions to my guide, which apparently made him feel very uncomfortable. Even though slavery was once widespread in Ethiopia and was not abolished until 1942, let that sink in, it seems that nobody really wants to talk about slavery in Ethiopia. There's only a handful of Ethiopian scholars who have dealt with this topic, and none of the museums in the country speaks about slavery in Ethiopia. That is why I decided to record this episode today and share my knowledge, my perspective, and my thoughts with you. Welcome to Plan B, Back to Africa. My name is Wayne, and on this channel I share my journey through the African continent and my knowledge and experience of leaving behind Germany to settle here on the African continent in Nairobi, Kenya to be precise. And I also love to share my knowledge and my experience on the socio-political realities here on the ground on the African continent. Now, without any delay, let's dive straight into today's topic, which is extremely controversial. I would say one of the most controversial topics when it comes to Ethiopian history: slavery in Ethiopia. So why is this topic so controversial? The answer is Ethiopian exceptionalism. Official narratives about Ethiopia focus either on its ancient Christian civilization or its reputation to have successfully resisted colonization. And therefore, dealing with slavery in Ethiopia and dealing with this dark chapter in Ethiopian history would challenge the discourse of Ethiopia's supposed exceptionalism. In my experience, especially proud Ethiopian nationalists, they get so mad when you bring up the topic of slavery in Ethiopia. It's not the first time that I'm speaking about slavery in Ethiopia on my social media platforms. The last time I did so was a year ago on Instagram, and in response I received so much hate. Imagine an entire thread and discussion was dedicated to me and to my post about slavery in Ethiopia, which essentially dealt with colorism and anti-blackness in Ethiopia, because I personally believe and I'm convinced that these two things are inseparably linked with each other. And so there was an Ethiopian woman who started a discussion and a thread on Reddit, on the platform Reddit. And what she basically was trying to do was to deny that colorism and anti-blackness exists, and dismissing my perspective and the experience of many dark-skinned Ethiopians who live through this experience of colorism and anti-blackness every day. And it was so funny to read her arguments. Whenever people came into the thread and said, yo, I experienced this, what this lady is saying is absolutely true because I've lived through this as a dark-skinned Ethiopian, this person would respond by saying, well, colorism is an issue everywhere, and especially on the African continent. It's not just an issue in Ethiopia. So essentially, she was admitting that colorism is an issue in Ethiopia, and her argument was deeply flawed. Just because it's an issue everywhere in Africa doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about colorism in Ethiopia in particular, especially since most discourses that revolve around Ethiopia are histories that glorify Ethiopia's past. I think it's also important to deal with those aspects of Ethiopian history that make people feel uncomfortable. And this is especially important because the legacy of these dark pasts, such as slavery, are still haunting the society in Ethiopia today. Colorism and anti-blackness are perfect examples of this. And in a sense, I have some understanding and compassion for these people who are clearly too proud to see, and that this pride that they have, this national pride, makes it so difficult for them to accept and see the truth. And I oftentimes have to think about a quote, or let's say an aphorism that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche made. It's about memories. In this case, it was about individual memory, but it can also be applied to collective memory. And this is really the case for every society, right? For every case of collective memory, where pride is one of the most powerful gatekeepers and determines what groups remember and what they would like to forget. So Friedrich Nietzsche has summed it up perfectly when he said, "I have done it, says my memory. I couldn't have done it, says my pride and stays adamant. Finally, memory gives in." And this perfectly sums up the collective memory when it comes to slavery of proud Ethiopian nationalists. In the end, I'm very happy and grateful that they started this thread on the platform Reddit, which was an attempt to attack and target me. However, in the end, this video went more viral because of this thread on Reddit, and many people who are victims of colorism, many Ethiopians who are victims of anti-blackness, came on this thread and shared their experiences. It's always so important and of so much value to hear the experiences of those who really suffered from colorism in Ethiopia, who have experienced it. And so at the same time, as I said, I understand how those Ethiopian proud nationalists feel, because every one of us knows how difficult it is to incorporate shameful aspects of our past. This can be on an individual basis or like on a collective basis when it comes to history, into our memories. And I remember vividly when I, as a young student, traveled to South America for a field research about resistance against slavery. I was in Colombia, and I vividly remember how I felt when my Professor Michael Soyske, who has done extensive research and has written so many books on the transatlantic slave trade, and his focus was on Cuba, the island where he also grew up. He's a German professor, and he told me, Wayne, are you actually aware of the fact that the Ethiopian Empire was also involved in the slave trade, not in the transatlantic slave trade though, but in the Red Sea slave trade, and that there is one well-recorded case of what he called a galla girl. So galla is a very derogatory and insulting term that was used to refer to the people, the Oromo people, right? And it's associated with backwardness. It's an Amharic term which was used by the imperial Amhara Shoan elite to refer to the Oromo people. And so, yeah, there was this case of this girl, which was of Oromo descent, that was given as a gift to a royal in Germany. And so when he spoke about that, I felt uncomfortable. I was like, wow, I didn't know about this part of my own history, and how does this actually affect me? The Abyssinian Empire was, without exception, ruled and dominated by the Tigrayan and Amharan ruling elite. And as a Tigrayan, as a light-skinned Semitic-speaking Highlander, and these people, as I said, dominated the Abyssinian Empire, I have to deal with this dark chapter of the past. And that is because whether I like it or not, I enjoy certain privileges. And that is even more important for me now that I have children born to a Nigerian father, dark-skinned children, and I've experienced so much colorism and anti-blackness in my family. Luckily not from my mother, who is a very mindful about this issue, who always speaks up whenever she witnesses colorism. But in my extended family, I've experienced so many cases where I had to respond to colorist remarks about my children, and remarks that involve texturism. An example of texturism, and a remark that I hear frequently when I'm in Ethiopia: "It's so sad that your daughter doesn't have your curly hair." Or whenever I'm in Ethiopia and I walk into a restaurant or cafe with my children, the people, they ask me, "Your children don't look Ethiopian. Is their father black?" And this is a very interesting comment, because it implies that Ethiopians don't consider themselves as black, at least Habesha people, because, you know, Ethiopia is a country where you have so many different ethnic societies, right? And not everyone is light-skinned. And so there are many people who identify themselves as Habesha people, especially among those who identify themselves as Habesha, mainly people from northern Ethiopia, central Ethiopia, who also don't consider themselves as black. However, the fact that some Ethiopians don't identify themselves as black is a topic for another episode, so let me know if you want me to speak about that. But today's topic, slavery and its legacy in Ethiopia, which is colorism and anti-blackness, is haunting Ethiopia's society until today. For example, these were just very, very harmless examples. What it gets more extreme when you consider that it's still very common to hear light-skinned Habesha people in Ethiopia and also in Eritrea refer to darker-skinned people, not just Ethiopians, as barias, which essentially means slave. And some people in the Reddit thread claim that, oh, it's not an insult. My mother used to call me baria and sometimes baricho. You know, baricho is the sweeter version of the term baria, which is, in my opinion, a very violent term, simply because it means slave, right? And it's also associated to a darker skin. And so the term baricho is the paternalistic version that is perceived as sweeter. However, the paternalistic version of the term baria. And so people were in the Reddit thread claiming it's not an insult, and yeah, she's exaggerating it. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And this whole discussion around the term barya reminded me a lot on the discourse around the N-word, you know, that we know from America, where some people say it's okay to say the word. Some, you know, I know this from Germany. There's this discourse, who's allowed to say the N-word and who not. And I clearly believe that we shouldn't use this word because it was used to insult us, to belittle us. It's a term that takes away the dignity of the person, right? And the same goes for the term barya. However, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, like with the N-word, whether your friends are allowed to say that to you and whether you have no problem with the term being applied to you. There's enough people who have been called that way since their childhood because of their darker skin, and who have been emotionally hurt and abused because of this word, who hate this word, who find this word rightfully disrespectful, especially because of its dark history. You can twist and turn it as you want. Same as the N-word, the term barya is for me morally indefensible. Case closed. Ethiopians who think otherwise, especially those who are not affected by it, are simply pathetic. Shame on you, really, shame on you. And it even makes me more mad when I see that, you know, it is undeniable that colorism is a big problem in Ethiopia. Just look at the crew of the Ethiopian airline. You will not find a single dark-skinned stewardess on board of the Ethiopian Airlines. And of course, there are some people who said, that's not true, I've spotted one. Good for you. You've spotted one out of how many? You can clearly see that there is a preference for lighter-skinned Ethiopians. So stay delusional, right? These things you can you can stay blind to them, but facts speak for themselves. It is clear that Ethiopia has a big colorism issue. And you can see that in so many institutions, not just in the Ethiopian Airlines. However, it's not just a structural problem and a problem on the institutional level, but especially in the society. Last year, when we went to the immigration office in Addis Ababa, me and my mother, we were sitting there in the waiting hall when this beautiful, tall, dark-skinned man entered the room. And there were a few ladies who were starting to gossip about him. There was this one lady, she was speaking in Amharic and saying, "Oh my God, have you seen how dark this man is? If I would have seen him in the village, in the mountains, I would drop dead out of fear." I'm so proud of my mom. I really, if you think I am cool, you should meet my mom. Like, she is so courageous. She always speaks out and she's so fearless. She looked at this woman and said to her, why would you get scared? Can't you see he's a human being like you? And then this woman, she was like a little bit uncomfortable, right? Because normally people, when they speak like this in public, they don't receive much, contestation. And so she said, come on, you know what I mean. She said, I don't know what you mean. You're useless, my mom said to her, right? I was like, oh, wow. I love the courage of this woman. And, this is just one example. I've heard so many cases where people shared the experience with me, where people told me, I used to work for the African Union, a friend from Uganda, for instance, and people were making noises of monkeys when he would go through the streets, right? There's so many people who have been insulted because of their dark skin in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa in particular, especially since Addis Ababa is the headquarters of the African Union. You will find Africans from across the continent living and working in Addis Ababa, and a lot of them have made these negative experiences. But we don't even have to go so far and ask dark-skinned Africans who work and live in Ethiopia. If you want to contest the claim that Ethiopia has a colorism issue, ask any native from the Gambela region or from the Benishangul Gumus region, right? Like probably the gentleman who was insulted at the immigration office in Ethiopia, obviously, when my mom spoke up, was an Ethiopian, because there was the immigration for renewal of Ethiopian IDs, the department for the renewal of the Ethiopian IDs. So it was clear that he was not a foreigner, but an Ethiopian. So ask any dark-skinned person native to the Benishangul Gumus area, Gambela area, or other southern and western areas, if that person has ever felt discriminated because of their skin colors, if that person has ever experienced being treated like a second-class citizen, and if this person has ever experienced being called barya, either as a nickname by people in his or her circle, or just publicly by random people on the streets. Anyway, back to slavery. There are so many people who claim that the system of slavery in Ethiopia was not race-based, like the one in the Western Hemisphere, the transatlantic slave trade, which was controlled by Europeans and targeted Africans just based on their skin color, but they claim that the system of slavery in Ethiopia was class-based. And while there is a certain truth in it, for instance, in the Fet Hanegast, which is the Law of the Kings, it's an ancient book from the Abyssinian Empire, where you can find rules and regulations of social life, culture in the Abyssinian Empire. There is a clear definition and there are clear rules and regulations as to who can be enslaved and sold to who. So, in essence, slavery was condoned. It was actually not just condoned, it was supported in the Feta Negast. So, it's absolutely nonsense to claim that slavery was not an issue when it was even regulated through a law book in the Abyssinian Empire. And now, what is interesting to me is that in the Feta Negast, it was stated that only non-Christians can be enslaved. And now to the people who claim that slavery was not race-based, but class-based, isn't it interesting that those who were considered to be slaves, that those non-Christian people who mainly inhabited the peripheries of the Abyssinian Empire, the southern parts and the western parts of the Abyssinian Empire, who were considered as of lower class, are also at the same time darker skinned. So essentially, people from the lower classes were in 90% of the cases also darker skinned people. Can we then still claim that skin color didn't play any role at all during the slave trade in Ethiopia? And when it comes to the legacy of slavery in Ethiopia, when the term baria, which means slaves, is exclusively used to describe a darker skinned person, I don't think that we can say skin color didn't play any role at all. To contest or downplay slavery in Ethiopia, some people claim that there is limited evidence. And as I have mentioned earlier, only a handful of Ethiopian scholars have extensively dealt with the topic of slavery in Ethiopia. But there is enough evidence out there, and the ancient paintings in the Ethiopian Orthodox churches are just one example. I'm currently reading a book called Children of Hope, which I can highly recommend. It's about a group of Oromo children who were sold into slavery and then rescued by British Navy ships who patrolled the Red Sea after they have abolished slavery. And so they have freed these children from the dhows, the traditional boats, and then these children were taken to Yemen, and later they were brought to a missionary school in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. That's a crazy journey that these kids made. So, they eventually ended up in South Africa. I really highly recommend this book. What makes this book so special is because these children were interviewed shortly, weeks after they have been captured. And so this is one of the very few, if not the only one, as far as I know, evidence and documentations of the first passage. So the first passage is considered the journey from the moment of capture to the coast, from where the kidnapped people, in this case children, were shipped to. In this case, they were meant to be shipped to Saudi Arabia, to the Middle East. And so, there's so much evidence, right, that shows that slavery was widespread in Ethiopia. And there is so much evidence about who was enslaving the people. And in this case, it was not Arab people, like is always claimed, that it was the Arabs who committed the slave trade in Ethiopia. The Africans who were enslaved were eventually sold to Arabs, yes, but it was not Arabs who raided and who captured those people, who kidnapped Africans and sold them into slavery. But what is also interesting is that the history of slavery is sometimes hidden in the heritage buildings that you find in Addis Ababa. Very few, though, that are left, but they do exist. I visited one particular heritage building while I was working for the Ministry of Tourism, and it belongs to Sheikh Ojele Hassan, who was the king of Asosa in the Benishangul Gumuz region. And he supplied Menelik, the emperor of Ethiopia at the time, with so many slaves. There's also a letter where Emperor Menelik, people always claim that he was fighting to abolish slavery, but there is a letter out there where he thanked one of the suppliers of slaves from the Western region for delivering slaves, but next time to make sure that that person sends more women and children. And so, you know, this building that is still standing in Addis Ababa is so full of history, a hidden history though, of a very dark chapter of Ethiopia's past, which is the slave trade, because the region where this king was based was one of the main sources from where the Abyssinian leaders and emperors and royals got their slaves, right? So it's really not difficult to find evidence for the slave trade, evidence that also point to the magnitude, the depth and the scope of the slave trade in Ethiopia. Apparently, not just proud Ethiopian nationalists, but even African Americans and some Caribbean people who should actually know better are so blinded by Ethiopia's supposed exceptionalism that they downplay slavery in Ethiopia with the words, oh, it's not comparable to the transatlantic slave trade, and the people who were enslaved were actually servants and not slaved, and they were treated much better, and they were treated like human beings and still were considered as part of the family. And this argument is deeply flawed for two main reasons, which I want to explain in detail now. But first, let me make clear that yes, of course, the slave trade in Ethiopia cannot be compared to the chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade in terms of its depth, scope, the violence that was unleashed on Africans, and the global impact. And it's true that slaves in Ethiopia, or some prefer to call them servants, did not experience the same level of cruelty that Africans that were enslaved into the Americas experienced. Having said that, let me explain to you why still this argument is very problematic. First, what is ignored here is the fact that there was not just domestic slavery in Ethiopia, but also a slave trade that exported Africans that were captured into the Middle East, and where people were sold, like you can see in the book Children of Hope, in the biographies of each of the children, that some children were sold for corn to merchants who then wanted to ship them to the Middle East. So yes, there were servants, yes, there was domestic servitude and slavery in Ethiopia, but there was also the slave trade, the brutal slave trade, dehumanizing slave trade that exported Africans to the Middle East. Secondly, I feel it's highly problematic to speak of the comforts of slavery. And that is what people do when they compare slavery in the Americas with slavery, domestic slavery in Ethiopia. And yes, the slaves in Ethiopia might have been considered as part of the family, might have kept to some degree their humanity and dignity. However, I feel what gets lost in this discourse, or what this speaking of the comforts of slavery does, is obscuring the fact that slavery, no matter where and in which form, is inseparably linked to violence. And I understand why it's so difficult to speak about slavery in Ethiopia, because it is this problem in Ethiopia that the Italians used as a pretext to colonize and to invade Ethiopia during the Second World War. So they claimed that they want to civilize Ethiopia, that they want to abolish the slave trade in Ethiopia, right? And I find it very interesting. I vividly remember I once read a book by an author. Her name was Italian author. She wrote a novel. Her name was Francesca Melandri, and the book was in German, but I'm sure you can find also the English version. And translated, the book title is Everyone Except of Me. Just try to look it up. So there is a scene in the book where she speaks about the black shirts, the fascists who invade Ethiopia. And there is a scene where a group of these Italian soldiers invade a village and free all the slaves, right? The domestic servants that were working for the families that were better off. And I will never forget the scene. There were those domestic servants who cried, who said, no, 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 we want to stay here. We don't know where to go. We don't have any place to go. How can we find food to eat? We will never find a job. And you see, I will never forget that, because it showed the complexity of domestic servitude in Ethiopia. Because those servants, right, that worked for the aristocracy in Ethiopia, for the Ethiopian ruling elite, and those Ethiopians that belonged to a higher class, they really didn't know what to do with their lives. They were already so enslaved with their minds, and the opportunities for them outside of this domestic servitude were so little that they preferred to remain in bondage, to remain in servitude, than to be free, right? So you cannot use this reaction that people, domestic servants who prefer to remain with their owners, to, downplay the brutality and the violence that comes with servitude and enslavement and any form of bondage. However, the Italians, as I said, used this as a pretext to justify their invasion and colonization. And interestingly, there were certain groups and societies in Ethiopia who collaborated with the Italians against the Abyssinian imperial regime. There are cases of societies, especially in the regions which were considered as the sources for slave raids, right? In the Benishangul Gumuz region, in the Gabela region, regions that were forcefully incorporated into the Abyssinian Empire through force and genocide, regions where the people are 99% dark-skinned. That it's not a coincidence that societies from these regions collaborated with the Italians to control for regime change, to overthrow the Abyssinian rulers, because these people have been enslaving these people, dark-skinned Ethiopians, for centuries. So, it's human, right? But still, whenever you speak about slavery in Ethiopia, or this act of collaborating with the Italians, right, which was mainly a result out of self-interest, you are labeled as a traitor. You are labeled as someone who plays into the hands of the oppressor. So whenever I speak about slavery in Ethiopia, just because Italians have used this as a pretext to justify the invasion of Ethiopia, that is why you are labeled as a collaborator of the colonizers, which is not true. I believe we must be able to speak about this. We must, if we want to create a society that respects all human beings, all people, whether they are dark-skinned, whether they are light-skinned. And we have so much work to do. But the problem is that I always see that when it comes to Ethiopia, not just Ethiopians who are blinded by Ethiopian exceptionalism, but even our African American brothers and sisters and African brothers in the diaspora and in other countries of Africa, they have certain double standards. And I believe that is because most of them have a very romanticized image of the Ethiopian empire in their mind, right? I like to call it, they have a Disneyland version of Ethiopian history in their mind, which is so far from the reality and the lived experience of Ethiopians, that especially those who suffered from the Ethiopian empire. And that begs the serious question, which I want to ask you: does anti-imperialism only applies when the imperialists are white and the victims of empire are black? Or does this also apply when the emperors are black and the victims are black. Same goes for slavery, in my opinion. And in today's topic, we were speaking about slavery in Ethiopia and its legacy, colorism and anti-blackness in Ethiopia. Why is it that this topic doesn't get the same outrage like slavery in other parts of the world where the perpetrators were white? We should seriously ask the question why that is, especially since the legacies of these dark chapters of the past are still haunting and dividing our societies today. So I want to ask you, do you think that it's necessary and important to speak about these topics, or do you think that we are playing into the hands of the oppressors and that this will cause more division? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I look forward to see you next time. Bye.